4 miles down in the Philippine Sea, deeper than any shipwreck ever found, something sits in crushing darkness that shouldn't exist at this depth. March 2021. Explorer Victor Vescovo descended in his submersible limiting factor to 21,180 feet below the surface. At this depth, the pressure is over 9,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crush an unprotected human instantly. What he found made naval historians weep. The USS Johnston, sitting broken on the sea floor, her hull number 557 still visible after 75 years. The destroyer that charged directly at the Japanese battleship Yamato on October 25, 1944, in what military experts call the most lopsided naval engagement in history. Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee Navy officer, had looked at 4 Japanese battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers bearing down on his small task force, and made a decision that defied every tactical manual ever written. He ordered his 700-ton destroyer to attack, alone, against ships that outweighed him by 40,000 tons. For 3 hours, the Johnston fought the entire Japanese center force. She put a torpedo into Yamato. She crippled a heavy cruiser. She drew fire away from the vulnerable escort carriers behind her. And when she finally went down, sinking stern first into the abyss, Japanese officers on the heavy cruiser Tone stood at attention and saluted her as she disappeared. Because what the Johnston did that day wasn't just brave, it was impossible. And the wreck sitting at 21,180 feet tells a story of heroism so extreme that even the enemy recognized it. To understand why finding the Johnston at record depth matters, you need to understand what happened on October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar in the Philippines. It's called the Battle off Samar, and it was the most improbable naval victory in American history. The context: the Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle in history. The Americans were invading the Philippines. Japan threw everything they had left at the invasion fleet in a desperate last gamble. Admiral Kurita's center force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan could assemble, was supposed to break through and destroy the vulnerable American invasion transports. 4 battleships including Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. This wasn't a raiding force. This was an armada designed to crush anything in its path. Standing between Kurita and the invasion fleet was Taffy 3, a task unit that had absolutely no business fighting battleships. 6 escort carriers, basically cargo ships with flight decks welded on. 3 destroyers including USS Johnston. 4 destroyer escorts, even smaller ships. Taffy 3 was designed to provide air support for ground troops and hunt submarines. They were not built to fight battleships. The escort carriers had thin hulls. They could maybe make 18 knots. Their guns were designed for shore bombardment, not naval combat. When Kurita's battleships appeared on the horizon at dawn on October 25, steaming at 30 knots, the officers on Taffy 3 knew they were looking at their deaths. The tactical situation was hopeless. Yamato alone displaced 72,000 tons and carried 9 18.1-inch guns that could hit targets 25 miles away. Taffy 3's entire force displaced maybe 25,000 tons total. Kurita had 23 ships. Taffy 3 had 13, most of them unable to fight capital ships. Any reasonable commander would have ordered immediate retreat, scattered the force, hoped some ships could escape while others died as decoys. Commander Ernest Evans wasn't reasonable. At 7 a.m., when Japanese shells started landing around the escort carriers, Evans made a decision. He ordered the Johnston to attack. Not defend, not screen, attack. He turned his destroyer directly toward the Japanese battle line and accelerated to flank speed. The Johnston's crew thought he was insane. Attack 4 battleships with a destroyer? The Johnston carried 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedoes. Yamato carried 9 18.1-inch guns, 12 6.1-inch guns, and armor so thick that 5-inch shells would bounce off like raindrops. But Evans had one advantage: aggression. Japanese doctrine assumed American ships would retreat when facing superior force. Evans was counting on the shock value of a destroyer charging directly at battleships to create confusion. At 7:10 a.m., steaming through his own smoke screen, Evans closed to 10,000 yards of the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano and fired 10 torpedoes. One hit. Kumano's bow was blown off. She dropped out of formation. Mission killed. But now the Johnston was alone, inside range of every Japanese ship in the center force, and they all started shooting at her. For the next 3 hours, from 7:15 a.m. to 10:10 a.m., the USS Johnston fought the entire Japanese center force. She zigzagged through shell splashes from battleship guns. She fired her 5-inch guns at targets 40,000 tons heavier than her. She laid smoke to protect the escort carriers. She charged at heavy cruisers to draw fire. Evans was everywhere on the bridge, conning the ship through a forest of shell splashes, ordering emergency turns that threw men off their feet, keeping the Johnston moving because stopping meant dying. At 7:30 a.m., 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Kongo struck the Johnston. One hit the bridge, killing or wounding most of the officers. One hit the engine room, killing the men there instantly and cutting the ship's speed by half. One hit the stern, destroying steering control. The Johnston should have been finished. Instead, Evans shifted to manual steering. Engine room crews bypassed damaged systems. Gunners kept firing even as Japanese shells continued to hit. By 9 a.m., the Johnston had taken dozens of hits. Her speed was down to 17 knots. She had no power to her gun mounts. Crews were loading shells manually. The bridge was destroyed. Half the crew was dead or wounded, and yet she was still fighting. Commander Evans, badly wounded himself, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, ordered the Johnston to attack again. He spotted the heavy cruiser Chikuma threatening the escort carriers and ordered a gun attack at point-blank range. 5,000 yards. Close enough to see the Japanese sailors on deck. The Johnston and Chikuma traded broadsides like ships of the line. A 700-ton destroyer was fighting a 12,000-ton heavy cruiser in a surface duel. For 35 minutes, they hammered each other. The Johnston scored multiple hits on Chikuma's superstructure. Chikuma's 8-inch shells tore through the Johnston's thin hull, but the destroyer's aggression forced Chikuma to break off her attack on the carriers. One small ship had stopped a heavy cruiser. At 9:45 a.m., Commander Evans knew it was over. The Johnston was dead in the water. She had no power, no steering, no fire control. Japanese destroyers were closing in for the kill. Evans gave the order to abandon ship. Survivors describe what happened next. Men jumping into oil-covered water as Japanese shells continued to fall around them. The Johnston listing heavily to port, her stern settling lower, and Commander Ernest Evans, wounded, burned, standing on the bridge as his ship went down. He was last seen removing his life jacket and giving it to a sailor who didn't have one. At 10:10 a.m., the USS Johnston rolled to port and slipped beneath the surface. She fell 21,180 feet to the bottom of the Philippine Sea, deeper than any shipwreck in history. Of the 327 men aboard, 186 survived. 141 died with their ship, or in the water after. Commander Evans was among the dead. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. But here's what makes the Battle off Samar extraordinary. The Johnston wasn't alone. The other destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy, 3 made similar suicidal attacks. The USS Howell charged the Japanese line and was sunk. The USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort, fought heavy cruisers for over an hour before sinking. The escort carriers launched every aircraft they had, attacking with bombs, torpedoes, and when they ran out of ammunition, making dry runs to distract Japanese gunners, and something impossible happened. Admiral Kurita, facing this insane aggression from ships that should have been running away, believed he was fighting a much larger force. He thought these escort carriers were fleet carriers. He thought the destroyers making torpedo runs were cruisers. The smoke, the chaos, the unexpected resistance, all of it made him think he'd stumbled into a trap. At 9:25 a.m., with victory in sight, with the escort carriers nearly in range of his battleship's guns, Kurita ordered a retreat. He turned his entire force around and withdrew. Taffy 3 had won. 6 escort carriers and 7 escorts had defeated 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, not through firepower, but through pure aggression and willingness to die. Military historians still argue about Kurita's decision. Some say he was traumatized by days of air attacks. Others suggest he overestimated the American forces. But Taffy 3 survivors know the truth. They won because ships like the Johnston convinced Kurita he was facing something impossible. The wreck of the Johnston remained lost for 75 years. The Philippine Sea where she sank reaches depths of over 20,000 feet in the Philippine Trench. Finding a single destroyer in that vast underwater canyon was nearly impossible. Depth was the primary obstacle. Commercial salvage technology maxed out around 6,000 feet. Military submarines could go deeper, but searching vast areas of seafloor at extreme depth was beyond their capabilities. For 7 decades, the Johnston remained one of the deepest undiscovered shipwrecks in history. Then, in 2019, explorer Victor Vescovo launched the 5 Deeps expedition, attempting to reach the deepest point in each of the world's 5 oceans. Vescovo had commissioned a new submersible, the Limiting Factor, specifically designed to reach full ocean depth. It could dive to 36,000 feet, deeper than any other manned vehicle, except the original bathyscaphe Trieste. During operations in the Philippine Sea, Vescovo decided to search for the Johnston. He had survivor reports that placed the sinking near the Philippine Trench. He had approximate coordinates from the battle. Using advanced sonar, his team began scanning the seafloor at depths that had never been explored. On March 31, 2021, sonar detected something at 21,180 feet, a large metallic object on a steep underwater slope. The shape suggested a ship. Vescovo piloted the Limiting Factor down through 4 miles of water. The descent took 4 hours. At these depths there is no natural light. The pressure is so intense that most materials would be crushed instantly. The submersible's titanium sphere kept Vescovo safe, but the external cameras and lights had to be specially designed to function under 9,000 psi. When the Limiting Factor's lights illuminated the seafloor, what Vescovo saw made him realize he'd found something historic. A destroyer lying on the steep slope of the Philippine Trench. The hull number 557 inches was visible on the bow. USS Johnston, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered. The wreck sits at an angle on the slope, broken into several sections, but largely recognizable. The bow section sits upright, the distinctive Fletcher-class destroyer profile clear even after 75 years. The stern section lies separate, evidence of the catastrophic damage the ship took during her final battle. Advanced photogrammetry from subsequent dives revealed details that tell the story of the Johnston's last stand. The bridge is heavily damaged, consistent with the 14-inch shell hit at 7:30 a.m. The hull shows dozens of shell impacts, large caliber hits from battleship and cruiser guns, smaller holes from destroyer gunfire. The ship's sides are literally perforated. But what's remarkable is what's still intact. The 5-inch gun mounts, though damaged, are still in position. The torpedo tubes, on the deck, empty, after firing at Kumano. The depth charge racks on the stern. The ship's bell, amazingly, is still attached to the superstructure. The preservation at this depth is extraordinary. The extreme pressure, cold temperature, and low oxygen create conditions where metal corrodes very slowly. The Johnston looks like she sank months ago, not 75 years ago. Subsequent dives by the ROV mapped the entire wreck site and recovered no artifacts. The Johnston is a war grave, protected by law. The 141 men who died with her remain entombed in the wreck, but the site provides forensic evidence of her final battle. The concentration of damage on the starboard side shows where Japanese heavy cruisers concentrated their fire. The destroyed bridge shows where the 14-inch shell from Kongo struck. The separated stern section suggests the ship broke apart as she sank through the water column, though some survivors reported she was intact when she went under. The discovery of the Johnston, at record depth, created international attention. Samuel Cox, director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, confirmed the identification in 2021. The wreck's location, the hull number, the damage pattern, everything matched the historical record of the battle off Samar. For the families of the 141 men who died with the Johnston, the discovery provided something they'd never had, a location. For 75 years, their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers had been lost in the deepest part of the ocean. Now they had coordinates. They had images. They had proof that the ship was resting in a place where she'd likely never be disturbed. The depth that made finding her so difficult also protects her. At 21,180 feet, no commercial salvage is possible. No sport divers will ever visit. The Johnston will rest undisturbed, 4 miles down, in the same darkness where she's been since October 25, 1944. But the Johnston's story is about more than just finding a deep shipwreck. It's about what she represents. Commander Ernest Evans was a Cherokee from Oklahoma. In 1944, Native Americans faced discrimination throughout American society. Evans graduated from the Naval Academy, earned command of a destroyer, and when faced with impossible odds, chose to fight rather than run. His decision probably saved thousands of lives on those escort carriers and invasion transports. The battle off Samar succeeded, because Evans and commanders like him were willing to sacrifice their ships and crews. Japanese Admiral Kurita retreated because he believed he was facing a force much stronger than Taffy 3 actually was. That illusion was created by the suicidal aggression of destroyers charging battleships, of escort carriers that refused to run, of pilots making attack runs with empty guns. Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation reads that he gallantly gave his life in the service of his country. But survivors say it differently. He charged 4 battleships with a destroyer and fought for 3 hours against impossible odds because someone had to. Because the carriers behind him were full of aircraft supporting American soldiers on Leyte. Because running would mean those carriers and transports would be destroyed. The Johnston's wreck tells us about the cost of that courage. The 141 men who died weren't all volunteers. Most were conscripts, sailors assigned to the ship. Many were teenagers. They didn't choose to fight battleships. They followed orders from a commander who asked them to do the impossible, and they did it. For 3 hours, they loaded guns manually when power failed. They steered by hand when the bridge was destroyed. They kept fighting when any rational assessment said they should surrender. The damage on the wreck shows what that fighting cost. Shell holes large enough to drive a car through. Bridge completely destroyed. Hull perforated by dozens of hits. The Johnston didn't just sink. She was systematically destroyed by ships many times her size. That she lasted 3 hours is testament to her crew's determination. There's a detail from the battle that survivor accounts preserve. As the Johnston was sinking, the Japanese heavy cruiser Tone was close enough that her crew could see the American destroyer going down. Japanese officers and sailors lined Tone's rail and saluted. It wasn't mockery. It was respect. Warriors recognizing warriors. The Johnston had fought impossibly well. She'd crippled a heavy cruiser. She'd damaged the Yamato. She'd disrupted the entire Japanese attack. Even her enemies recognized the magnitude of what she'd accomplished. That salute, from Japanese officers to a sinking American destroyer, represents something profound about military honor. Even in total war, even when facing an enemy you're trying to kill, there are moments where courage transcends nationalism. The Johnston at 21,180 feet represents the deepest such moment in naval history. Today the wreck is protected under the Sunken Military Craft Act. No salvage is permitted. No artifacts can be recovered. The site is monitored but left undisturbed. 141 American sailors remain aboard, including Commander Ernest Evans. They've been at that depth for 80 years now. The pressure that would kill a human in seconds has become their tomb's protection. Victor Vescovo's discovery allows the Navy to officially recognize the site as a war grave. Families can finally have closure, knowing where their loved ones rest. Naval historians can study the damage patterns and understand exactly how the Johnston fought and died. And the world can honor the deepest shipwreck ever found as a monument to courage under impossible circumstances. But the Johnston's legacy is more than her wreck. It's what she represents about facing impossible odds, about commanders who lead from the front, about crews who follow orders even when those orders mean probable death, about the moments in war when tactical insanity becomes strategic genius. Commander Evans didn't have time to calculate odds when he ordered the attack. He saw battleships threatening carriers and made an instant decision to engage. That decision violated every tactical manual. Destroyers don't fight battleships. They screen. They make smoke. They run. But Evans understood something the manuals didn't. Sometimes the only way to win is to do something so unexpected, so aggressive, that it breaks the enemy's decision-making cycle. Kurita expected American ships to retreat. When they charged instead, when destroyers made torpedo runs at point-blank range, when escort carriers refused to run, it shattered his situational awareness. He couldn't reconcile what he was seeing with what he expected. That cognitive dissonance, that moment of confusion, gave Taffy 3 the opening they needed to survive. Modern naval doctrine has studied the battle off Samar extensively. It's taught at war colleges as an example of how inferior forces can defeat superior forces through aggression and surprise. The Johnston's charge is specifically analyzed as a case study in tactical audacity. But doctrine and case studies can't capture what it felt like on that bridge. Evans, wounded and bleeding, conning his dying ship through shell splashes, ordering gun crews to keep firing even as power failed. The crew, knowing they were probably going to die, loading shells manually, steering by hand, fighting because their commander was fighting. That's something beyond tactics. That's human beings choosing to fight impossible odds because the alternative is abandoning the people depending on them. At 21,180 feet, the Johnston rests as the deepest monument to that choice. The wreck will sit there for centuries, possibly forever. The extreme depth means natural deterioration is incredibly slow. Marine life at that depth is sparse. There's no sunlight, no photosynthesis, minimal biological activity. The Johnston exists in a state of preservation that would be impossible at shallower depths. Future generations with better technology may be able to explore the wreck more thoroughly, map every detail, perhaps even glimpse inside sealed compartments. But they'll be looking at the same thing Victor Vescovo saw in 2021, a destroyer that fought far beyond any reasonable expectation, a ship that charged battleships and survived 3 hours of concentrated fire from the most powerful surface fleet Japan could assemble, a monument to courage that sits at the deepest point any shipwreck has ever been found. 141 American sailors continue their eternal patrol at 21,180 feet, deeper than the Titanic, deeper than the Bismarck, deeper than any other war grave in the ocean. They rest in a place so remote, so extreme, that they'll likely never be disturbed. The pressure that would crush visitors in seconds has become their protection. The darkness that would blind anyone who descended has become their peace. 4 miles down, in the Philippine Sea, the USS Johnston sits broken but defiant, her hull numbers still visible, her guns still trained toward the enemy she fought, her crew still aboard, still on station, still standing their watch. The deepest heroes in naval history,